Well, I think when it comes to China, we know Colombo is well aware of India's sensitivities, particularly in the security realm. India and Sri Lanka has very close relations, security and defense relations. We have the tri-party India, Maldives, Sri Lanka Security Conclave, which is headquartered at Colombo, and that is particularly on maritime security, where they share information. So I think Colombo is well aware of the concerns that New Delhi has, and I think that's one of the reasons that perhaps Sri Lanka is still considering this request, and permission has not actively been granted.
Welcome to Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Good evening. Welcome to the gist. Sri Lanka's romance with Chinese survey vessels appears to be continuing. Next month, a Chinese survey vessel, the Shi Yan, I understand, has sought permission to carry out a survey in Sri Lankan waters. It will be there for a period of about 10 days, maybe more. And it may even dock at a Sri Lankan harbour. As you're aware, last year there was the Yuan Wang 5, which created a bit of a controversy in India because it was present in waters close to India when various satellite launches were taking place. So there's a lot of concern in India that the Chinese were there to spy, and the Sri Lankans were, in a sense, facilitating them. So we're going to look at this issue again, and given the fact that you have another survey vessel coming in next month. Standing by in Colombo is my guest, Asiri Fernando. He is the news editor of the Sri Lanka morning newspaper. Asiri, glad to have you.
Hello, glad to be. Thank you for having me.
Asiri, the survey vessel that is coming into Sri Lanka, which has sought permission to come to Sri Lanka. Can you update us on what the development is? Is it going to dock somewhere? How long is it going to be?
Well, nothing is finalized as of today. It is my understanding that the Chinese vessel Shi Yan 6 sought permission way back as April for this mission. And according to the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry, Sri Lanka has not yet notified the Chinese about whether they have been given permission or not. It's still being considered. So no dates are fixed. And according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the survey territory has not yet been approved as well. So that's where things stand at the moment, but we do know that Shi Yan 6 has begun her journey into the Indian Ocean, and according to Chinese media, it's a 80-day expedition into the Indian Ocean region. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Is it normal for such surveys to be carried out? I'm not referring only to Chinese ships. Do other ships of other navies also do the same?
Well, in Sri Lanka's history, there have been several joint surveys. The most recent one was after, if you recall, the recent it was a commercial vessel, Express Pearl, which caught fire and sank off the Colombo anchorage. And Sri Lanka invited the Indian Navy to send their hydrographic vessels to map the coastal waters and the approaches to the Colombo harbor, because there was debris that was submerged. And that greatly helped Sri Lanka to ensure safe navigation around the Colombo port and to get the port back into operation. So there have been joint surveys even back as 2002. There was an Indian survey ship that carried out a joint survey with Sri Lankan scientists along its coastline. And I think way back, even in the 80s and 70s, we had collaborations with the Norwegians and several Nordic countries when the rule of law, rules for law at sea were drafted. There were multiple surveys. So this is not the first time such a joint survey is being undertaken. Of course, permission has not yet been given to the Chinese vessel, from what we know.
So this would also be a joint survey between the Sri Lankans and the Chinese?
Yes, that is my understanding. It is thought that one of the Sri Lankan universities and a state institution, NARA, will have their research scientists on board for this survey if it is approved.
Mhm. And is it regular to do this with the Chinese? Or I mean, you did say that the Sri Lankans have worked with the Indian Navy too on this. But are the Chinese, the graph of cooperation with the Chinese, is that growing? Is that going up?
Well, the Chinese engagement has certainly picked up after the end of the conflict.
Mhm.
Since 2014, there were several joint surveys, particularly with local research bodies such as the universities joining up. But well, China's inroads to the Indian Ocean is a debated topic, and I'm sure Colombo is concerned about how it is perceived.
Is there something special that the Sri Lankans are getting by cooperating with the Chinese on such surveys?
Mm, No, not to my understanding. I mean, such surveys can be done with many partners. One
Mhm.
of the key issues, of course, is that Sri Lanka doesn't have the sovereign capacity to do advanced maritime research on their own.
I see.
There's a capacity gap, and Sri Lanka ought to address that. And I think that discussion is happening at the policy level. But
Mhm.
due to the lack of sovereign capacity, Sri Lanka often works with another party. I think somewhere between 2015 and 2017, there was a um, joint effort with an Australian university where a seaborne glider, an unmanned glider, was dispatched from the western coast of Australia and along the Indonesian archipelago came to Sri Lanka, and that was tracking wave movements and collecting data on fisheries. So there
Mhm.
have been collaborative efforts in the past.
So, what exactly are the Chinese surveying? What is it that they're trying to, um, what data are they trying to gather?
Well, from what I understand, of course, I'm not privy to the exact survey requests that they have made, but the vessel of its class, it's a hydrographic vessel, but it can carry multiple sensors. So I think uh, earlier Chinese did do several surveys with local universities to try to locate wreckages of historic Chinese navigators who came to the Indian Ocean. Uh, but this particular one, what exactly they are going to do is still unknown. It's not in the public domain.
Mhm. Do the Chinese share data with the Sri Lankans?
On this particular trip, I don't know, but what I do know is Sri Lanka is drafting a standard operations procedure to grant diplomatic clearance for such requests for foreign warships and research vessels, and I think that's a very comprehensive one. And it is my understanding that there is um, part of that includes where Sri Lanka would ask for the data collected in Sri Lankan waters and in our economic zone to be given to the Sri Lankan government. So if it's a joint research, I'm sure there is some mechanism in place to collect the data.
Mhm. You mentioned this current survey is being done in collaboration with a university and a government agency.
Yes, yeah. So Ruhuna University in the south of the country, which has a faculty on ocean sciences, and NARA, the state entity that looks into research matters and is a regulator for activities at sea uh, and fisheries. So both parties, I believe, are working with this research effort.
Mhm. So the question that is being asked here in India um, is India making too much of a thing about Chinese vessels there? Or is it something that is pushing the Sri Lankans to allow such Chinese survey vessels to come? So, how would you answer that?
Well, I think when it comes to China, we know Colombo is well aware of India's sensitivities, particularly in the security realm. India and Sri Lanka has very close relations, security and defense relations. We have the tri-party India, Maldives, Sri Lanka Security Conclave, which is headquartered at Colombo, and that is particularly on maritime security, where they share information. So I think Colombo is well aware of the concerns that New Delhi has, and I think that's one of the reasons that perhaps Sri Lanka is still considering this request, and
Mhm.
permission has not actively been granted. Um, so Sri Lanka understands, I think, with this president uh, coming into power last year, he has made it very clear that on matters of security, Sri Lanka will work closely with India. It goes, without saying, India has been helping capacity build with the Sri Lanka Navy and the Air Force as well, particularly for maritime surveillance and maritime patrol duties. So, is India making a big fuss? Well, we saw the Indian media respond to UN Bank 5 last year in
Mhm.
it. And again, if you remember, Sri Lanka first granted permission, then rescinded permission and granted permission after um, a week or so. So the
Yeah.
visit, the port call was pushed back. So I think Colombo is trying to accommodate the concerns as well as have some sovereign control over who visits Sri Lanka, because while India is a close neighbor and for all intensive purposes our closest partner on security matters, Sri Lanka has to continue partnering with other countries for its interests as well. This is
Mhm.
why I say the issue about lack of sovereign capability is something that ought to be addressed by Colombo. Because if we can help our own researchers, you know, have the equipment and the platforms to do the research they need, then Sri Lanka would not have to collaborate with multiple parties. They could do it alone.
Mhm. There is an impression in some quarters here in Delhi that there is a vein of anti-Indian sentiment in Sri Lanka, and we've seen this in across our neighborhood. So, in that sense, in Sri Lanka, it won't be anything new or novel. And throughout the period of the civil war, there were these constant suspicions about India's intentions, and I do recall facing some of these suspicions on my visits there at that time. Do you
Mhm.
think this is something that is something is there? This anti-Indian feeling?
Well, I won't call it anti-Indian sentiment or feeling, but I think there is, based on the events of what transpired in the 1980s, particularly with the LTT insurgency and how they grew. And Sri Lanka has openly stated that there was active support from India to train
Yeah.
LTT on Indian soil. So yes, I think there are some parties in Sri Lanka who there is there have been long-standing concerns. So there is a cloud that hangs over some Indian projects and some Indian interventions. There's always people who doubt India's interests. Whereas China, from the wartime experience, is seen as someone who was ready to support, whether it be with arms, munitions, training. Whereas India was not very much forthcoming with kinetic systems. But in India's defense, I mean, India did offer a wide-ranging platform for training Sri Lankan personnel, and to this day, I think India offers the highest portion of foreign training for Sri Lankan officers and other ranks. So I think there is an unaddressed distrust in some quarters that remains from their legacy issues from the Elam conflict, and it would take time, obviously, for those concerns to be addressed. But I don't see anyone using that as an excuse to tilt towards China, because I think Colombo, especially the policymaking community, is well aware that Sri Lanka has to, be very balanced in their approach.
Mhm. So you mentioned there's a lot of training that India provides to Sri Lankan naval personnel.
Yes.
Does this include maybe uh, survey techniques? Has Sri Lanka at any time requested for perhaps a survey vessel of the kind that we have, that the Indian Navy has?
Mm, I don't know whether Sri Lanka has made a request for a survey vessel, but I know Sri Lankan hydrographers have trained in India. Sri Lankan clearance divers train in India, and even Sri Lankan naval officers who specialize in anti-submarine warfare train in India.
Mhm.
So there was this incident very recently where Sri Lanka sent one of its offshore patrol vessels south of the equator to respond to a capsized Chinese fishing vessel, which
Mhm.
was actually in the Australian search and rescue region. And the Sri Lankan Navy commander, speaking about it later, said it was a fusion of effort because the ship was donated by the United States. The
Mhm.
divers were trained in India, and the party we were going to rescue were
Mhm.
Chinese in the Australian search and rescue region. So it shows how Sri Lanka works with all partners, and when it comes to maritime matters, Sri Lanka is a first responder along with India in the Indian Ocean. And
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there was a specific request for a survey vessel, but India, on Sri Lanka's request, provided a line of credit in the last decade. And Sri Lanka purchased two offshore patrol vessels built in Indian shipyards, which are now part of our fleet. And Sri Lanka also has several other ships that have been donated by the Indian Navy and the Coast Guard. So the Navy to Navy cooperation is very strong between India and Sri Lanka. In fact, Sri Lanka Coast Guard has a SOP, MOU on SOP on how to respond to each other's requests,
Mhm.
which I think was one of the first in the region between two coast guards. So that bond is very strong when it comes to maritime security.
Mhm. So what you're hinting at is, I mean, I don't know if you're hinting, but there is the political issue, isn't there? Somewhere deep inside the Sri Lankan psyche, there's this thing of this big brother out there, and we need to ensure that we keep a little balance.
Mm, Well, I think that can be said for any big powers, big country, small country relationship. It's there for many island states that sit opposite, a large continent.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think in Sri Lanka's terms, uh, both countries, in my opinion, should look at moving forward from the legacy issues, and there should be trust, uh, way to build trust on both sides. India has been extremely helpful during the economic crisis and the
Yeah.
COVID-19 pandemic. India was the first to respond in both cases and was very steadfast in supporting Sri Lanka. And I don't think that has gone, uh, unnoticed. Sri Lankans know it. Uh, like even yesterday with the cricket match, when India won, uh, of course Sri Lankans were sad, but everyone was happy the match was over. People cheered each other, shook hands. So that cross-strait linkages, I think, are very strong. Uh, and with a bit of effort, you could strengthen that more.
Mhm. So let me get back to the Chinese. What is the perception in Sri Lanka about what the Chinese are doing through such surveys? What is the, I'm a journalist like you, what do you guys talk about when you are discussing this?
But there is concern. There is concern because matter, for us, there isn't enough transparency. So
Mhm.
that raises a concern for anything. I mean, it's not just China, for any country, any project, any research. Uh, that is the same. Also, I think, given China's involvement in Sri Lanka over the last decade, there is some concern when China approaches to carry out a survey or get involved in an infrastructure project. The public obviously are now asking questions about investments and other things. So for us, the lack of transparency is concerning. And uh, yes, I mean, it would be good if the academia also came out and explained what they were planning to do with this research, where this data will be used. Uh, because we know that some of the data that can be used for dual purpose, which I think is a concern for India as well. So those concerns are there in the Sri Lankan uh, community as well. What, why are they here? What are they looking for? What will the data be used? Who will have access to it? Those are all questions that Sri Lankan media landscape asks as well. Uh, and I hope that someone in the state steps forward and answers them. Because as long as there's confusion about what exactly is going on,
Yeah.
cloud will hang over it.
Mhm. And last question, given how China behaved during your economic crisis, um, are there questions being asked about the reliability of China as a economic partner, as a strategic partner?
Well, China has been supportive, but on the debt restructuring matter, uh, China's early absence from the table, of course, was noticed. But
Yeah.
China does diplomacy in its own way. It doesn't
Hmm.
play by anyone's rule book. It has
Rules.
its own way of doing things. So I think Sri Lanka, it's a complex navigation for Sri Lanka to ensure China still partakes in the debt restructuring process and offer the same terms to the other parties involved, which is what the IMF and even the World Bank and India has asked for, that everyone be served with the same spoon. So yes, China's reluctance to come forward to the table early on, I think, is a concern. In fact, and it's still, we are still wondering how will they respond to what kind of haircut would they agree to, because it seems that they are comfortable with pushing debt repayment back instead of taking a haircut. But that is
Mhm.
not what the others have agreed to at the table. So there are concerns about how China will respond. For Sri Lanka, of course, it's very difficult because Sri Lanka has to get all parties to agree to it. And
Yeah.
that's the big challenge for Sri Lanka right now.
Mhm. So, is there any discernible anti-Chinese sentiment in Sri Lanka?
There's quite, I think, a strong concern about China's interest in Sri Lanka, and particularly in the north and east as well. We've seen, politicians and uh, civil society groups question when China tries to uh, start a project in those areas. Uh,
Yeah.
we know even in the south, when China tries to secure certain tenders for infrastructure projects, questions are asked. I mean, there is scrutiny. And even during the political unrest last year, uh, the protest movement, the youth were questioning, uh, not just Chinese investments, even Indian and other investments, like how has things materialized? What are the
Yeah.
outcomes? Has it trickled down to the common man? So those questions are being asked now, and I think the younger generation is, keeping a close eye on the government, and it's not going to be easy do what anyone did before, because there will be scrutiny.
So whether it's China or India, in a sense, the Sri Lankans see both in equal terms, in a sense that they are. Would you
Mm,
say that?
no, I don't think so. I think right now, with the support and unwavering support that India showed during the economic crisis and COVID-19, I think generally there is India has a better outlook in Sri Lanka in terms of what the people think about India.
Mhm. But
Of
there's
course, we
always
may
a but
differ.
over there somewhere. There's always the but somewhere.
Well, such is how it is. I mean, you come to a cricket pitch, Sri Lankans will will not feel the same, I guess. But
Yeah,
I think India is held in high standing with in many communities.
yeah. So, Asiri, thanks very much. You've been very measured. But as you also mentioned, as a small neighboring country, there will always be a sense of perhaps insecurity, maybe a little suspicion and distrust, which is perhaps par for the course. And that's something that countries like India have to live with. Asiri, thanks very much. And great talking to you again. And I'm
Thank
sure
you very much.
we'll. Thanks very much for that insight.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you on this conversation on the gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good night.